Yeah, a little bit of history about myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about Toki, to give you guys some context. I've been a programmer nerd since before I can remember, I think. I started out being a teacher at the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam, the Hogeschool van Amsterdam. After a couple of years, I started a small game studio with a couple of friends, and then we made a PC game and some mobile games. I think they were fun games, but we weren't very successful in the numbers, sadly. I'm still very happy with the time spent there. And then I got a position as a backend engineer at Blendle. Who here has ever heard of Blendle? And that was super fun because it was an up-and-coming startup with a lot of media traction. So I kind of made the switch there and learned a lot about backend engineering, which I really fell in love with. As a game developer, I was already a little bit of a technical guy doing physics and networking and stuff like that. And after about 5 years of that, I decided it was time to move on. So I started at Poki about 3 years ago, I think. And there, I'm still a backend engineer, but Poki is a company in the games industry, so best of both worlds for me. Really good there, actually. Poki is a web game portal. Here's a little screenshot of it. It's where kids of all ages come to play video games when they're bored. And we have about 40 million unique users a month, which we're really happy with. And our game developers are also really happy with because they get to play their games. We work with those developers directly, so some of our games are bought in or are licensed basically. But we like to work with developers, so we work with them on a revenue share basis. We make sure we have enough users for their games, and we put some advertisements around that. I also don't like advertisements, but I like game developers getting paid. And they make awesome games for us and for the players, of course. At Poki, all our backend is done in Golang, hence why I'm here. My colleague, Erik Dubbelboer, who was originally giving a talk here, is a colleague of mine, also a backend engineer, also in Golang. That's about me and Poki. Today, I'm going to talk to you about testing your Golang APIs with Cucumber. This is a technique I learned at Blendle in Ruby. We also did Cucumber in Python, and now I'm doing it in Golang at Poki. And we're really happy with it. I think it's worth talking about because it makes my life so much easier as a backend engineer. We'll talk about testing your APIs. Normally we're using Cucumber. Can talk a little bit about the whys, the why nots maybe, and I'll have a little demo where we can see it working hopefully. It's always I guess doing a demo live. And then some closing notes and time for questions. Slides are a little bit rough. I made them this morning. So for me also, next slide. What's my next slide? Oh, I made a title slide. Cool. If you have any direct questions, short questions, feel free to ask while I'm talking. It's fine. Rather ask me immediately so you can understand the rest of my course. Cool. What is Cucumber? What did I put on this slide? Cucumber is a sort of specification, a language, a simple rule set on writing scenarios. I hope you can read it. Here's the example I pulled from their own homepage. You write in English, I think if there's another language supported, you write a scenario for a feature with a little context. And this can be anything. It can be something very technical. Given I start with 1 and I add 2, I get a 3. It can be very business-like. Given the user paid $10, they spend so much tax, whatever. And it's always in the, if you look at a scenario, it's always in the first couple of givens, a little bit of background of the scenario. Given these users exist, or given the user is logged in. Then there's something that happens, so when the user logs out, or does a query, or whatever. And then there's expected results. Then I expect this to happen, or I expect this to happen. And as you can see, it's very simple. You don't need to be a coder to read this, or know a specific language. Well, if you want to read a unit test in Golang, you need to know Golang. And what they say, I also shamelessly pulled that image from their website. It's trying to mix automated tests with living documentation, which like readable but executable text. And you can use Cucumber in, I think, almost any languages. I've used it in these four. In Ruby and Python and Blendle, and here at Poki, I'm using it in Golang and JavaScript. And the fun thing there is the feature test is the same. Actually, at Blendle, we had a small Ruby microservice which had its tests written in Cucumber. And when we rewrote it to Golang because it wasn't performing anymore, we already had our test suite ready. We used the same test suite to like check if our new service was working correctly, which is very nice. Now, I can almost hear you thinking, well, how do you run this? How is this a test? How could this be a test? Well, it's actually very stupid. What you do, and this is a little bit of boilerplate you have to do if you're using Cucumber, is for every of those step definitions, these lines, you write a little regular expression matching it, and you tell it which code to run in your language, either in Golang in this case, or in Ruby or whatever. So to make this stupid example test working, it's not valid Golang. I define all the steps, and with the is hungry, I put the name on 0 and say that Alice is active. She eats a number of cucumbers. I will just add the amount. This is a very simple example. And then the then step, the then shouldn't be here. I check if I got the correct result. She's not. And if it's not, I'll print and return an error. And now you can run this. There are runners in Golang. It's called Godog. That's their little logo. That will parse the input file. It matches all the steps. If there's a step it can't find, it will ever. And you have to make it. Yeah, looking at how I can fix it a little. Yeah. And then you can run your test. But this example isn't very clear, I think, so let's give another couple of other examples. This is actually an example I got from a friend of mine today who uses Cucumber in a very non-technical sense. They only use the specification to define user stories and like features they want their developers to work. So it's something like, given the context is created, if the context is ready to sign, the seller has agreed with these terms and conditions. I don't think there's any code behind this. This is just a way to talk the same language, basically, which is very clear. On the right is more of a technical thing I'm going to talk more about. It's testing an API, and there's very technical. Like when the client does a GET request to /health, I expect the response code to equal 200, and the response body should be this JSON bit. And another example from my hobby project in JavaScript, or in TypeScript actually. It's a networking library, and there I say given green, which I'm calling our player's colors, is ready, is connected to the network, he'll receive a ready event with this peer ID. So you can use Cucumber for all different kinds of applications. Some of them technical, some of them not. It's up to you and what you want to do. I believe Cucumber, the company and everybody themselves are focusing more also on the user story base, where your business director can check if the scenarios are correct, etc. But I'll be focusing more on the actual technical checks and tests, which I think are very useful. So now to talk about testing, who here tests their APIs? Automatically. Okay. Who here tests their APIs also manually, either with curl or running your front end locally? There's a little overlap there. Cool. I never run my API locally. I don't even know how to. I don't by heart know which environment variables I need. I have never run the Poki front end on my laptop. I only use feature tests, and if they're green, I'm happy and I'll push it to production. More on that later. If you have a handler in Golang, you're kind of going to assume everybody here has done it, because it's one of the main hello rules to create your HTTP handler. It doesn't really matter if you don't get this. Just then just accept that this is complicated and stupid for my next point. For those who have created handlers, this is how maybe a normal Golang test would look like, where you create your fake request in a recorder, you create some mock stores or a fake client, and you set up some context, like I add 2 users to the mock store, because this is the listing of users test. Then you create your handler, you call it, and then you check some state if it did the correct thing. This looks normal, right? And how you would do it, maybe a little bit simple, maybe a little boilerplate. This is fine. There are, however, some issues with this, I feel. First, you need to learn Golang if you want to read this a little bit, please. Secondly, if you write this before you have your handler, you're going to get a lot of red lines under your code because the handler doesn't exist yet. It doesn't know which stores it will accept, etc. I'll go more a little bit of pros and cons later. The same test could look like this in Cucumber. I even made it a little bit more extensive, like there are 2 teams and I'm only listing 1 team. Where first, I'll give some background, given these teams, and here I'm using AND keyword, and that's basically another given. But if you would repeat the word given, it wouldn't read as nice. So, but the runner knows that it's a given. So given these team records and these user records, everybody could understand what's happening here in the database. When the client does a GET request to team/1/users, I'm expecting then the response code equals 200. The response header should be this, and the response body should be that. Understandable for everybody, agreed? Even if you haven't done any Golang. Also, if you have to create a front end for this is a nice bit of information. Like I know exactly what to do to get what result, and which fields I'll get, etc. And the fun thing about this is you can write this without having even installed Go on your computer. And that's, I think, for me, one of the more important reasons to use this, because when I'm making a new feature at Pokey, we'll first talk about what we want as like a product thing, and then we'll talk about how does the database look like, what do we need from the front end. And then before I start coding the back end, I'll write a couple of these, like how I want the thing to work. And I haven't written a line of Golang yet, or any other programming language. And then when I think, well, this is how it should look like, I send this to my front enders and say, could you work with this? Am I forgetting a field? Do you need another relationship between certain entities? Are you missing a filter field or something that I forgot in the scenario, basically? They'll give some feedback on it, and maybe it will completely change. They'll say, well, I didn't expect to list teams on a user on a team, I expected it the other way around. And then I'm really glad I didn't write a lot of Go code yet. So that's really nice. And then one important thing is, the text I'm using here, like the sentence, the client does a GET request to, and then a path, I just made it up. You can do whatever. And there are, I think, some like rules on what kind of grammar tense forms it should be, like should it be in the past tense or in the future tense. I don't fuss about that too much. I'm sure there's a lot of mistakes in here. For example, then the response code should equal 200, might be better. But yeah, you can make it up as long as you use the same as the rest of your team, it's fine. And now I'm really curious what the next slide is. Yeah. And the fun part is you can also decide how these steps handled. For example, at Pokey, we decided in our test suite to not mock the database, but to use an actual database when running the test. So when I fire my test, it quickly spins up a MySQL Docker container to run my testing. Like it's a database per scenario, basically. And then given these teams records could look a little bit like this, and it's, I think, not valid Golang. It's just about the example where somewhere I define these little bit of regex for the name records is this method or function, and in that function in Golang I create a database transaction. From the table you'll get like the ID name and one and team name. You'll get class as an argument, I extract the headers, I create a prepared statement for MySQL, and in the for loop I'll add all of these teams, basically. And the teams is the table name. Super simple, and now I've already implemented one step for two of these, basically, because I can now just edit database. And in the actual implementation, there's also, I can also say even only these teams, which first removes all other teams, so it's a clean look. So that's how you would implement it. And that feels like that's a lot of work, but on my day-to-day basis, it rarely happens I have to implement a new step definition. It happens once every 2 to 3 months now that I write a new type of step definition, basically. And then, yeah, it's like a 2-minute job to do this. It doesn't even have to be stable words because it's test code. And you don't write tests for your test code. It's usually not that much work. And starting now, if you would start at Poke as a backend developer, you don't even know what these step definitions are. You don't have to, because you have your data already exists. You just have to copy them in the same format as there, which helps. I even had some front-enders sending me over Slack, like, this is a scenario I would like to, and he almost had it right. Like, I could almost just copy-paste it into my test suite and have it run as that, which is really nice. Imagine if you're one higher level of higher abstraction, where your business logics is written in Cucumber, your product managers could write tests to, hey, I think a user said this was wrong, let me try to make a test that fails. And then here, this test fails, fix it for you. Imagine a world where your product manager writes your tests for you. Really good. Yeah, that's how to look at it, basically. Does that make sense? Does it make clear to how to, yeah, your question.
How would you do the context? So in this scenario,
yeah,
you use the database, but if you don't want to use an actual database, but you want to use the memory thing, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. There are a couple of ways to do context. In this case, I'm using a global that doesn't exist. You could, if you abstract your store, for example, you have your user store with a SQL implementation, but also a memory implementation. You could use your memory implementation here. And here I'm using a function in global, but in my actual code it's a struct with methods, and the function it registers at the step is a method actually, and on the struct is a database connection or a mock from a client or something. Does that make sense?
May you appear before the first run of the scenario?
Yeah, like the runner, GoDoc, has a hook like before scenario and after scenario, and then I do something really stupid. I migrate my database completely down and up again, which removes all the tables and creates them again. So, very clean slate. That's a little bit icky, but it works really fast and really good. And what's really nice is from working with an actual database, yeah, I see, we also test our queries. Like if our queries correct, because we're actually running it in a database. Like if I make a SQL error or something, I'm using a feature of SQL, I'll test it as well. You have a question?
Yeah. So in this context, are you using an actual database? Would you recommend like seeding the database in these functions, or seeding it like having a separate seeder every time when you're spinning it up?
I recommend having an empty database and seeding it in a context. So when you read such a scenario, you have everything you need to know to understand the scenario. And there's a thing you can do. You can say background, a semicolon, and then do some steps that will be run before every scenario. It's like a sort of, and it reads really nice. Background given these teams, and then in the teams you add some users. In the scenario you add some users. I'll show that when I open Visual Studio. I can give a couple of examples. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend having a populated database for your class because it doesn't read as nicely. And it's also difficult to change because maybe there's a bug in my system where if your name is Koen, it crashes. I just have to change one of those names to have like a regression test. Yeah, one more question.
Do you like share scenarios across different tests? So you can have like the same tables in different tests.
Yeah.
And override that.
Yeah, as I said, you can have like the given steps in the backgrounds thing, and there are things I never used it called examples, where you write like a generic templated scenario with like variables, and in the example you have a table of these variables, so you can test them with different kinds of inputs basically. Yeah.
excuse me, is it also able to test asynchronous things like putting things in the queue or reading from queue or those kind of things?
It can basically do anything you can program in Go, because you write your own steps. If you want to put something in a queue here, you can. And in my networking code, there are some step definitions, because the networking library I'm working on is all kinds of asynchronous things. It's horrible to test. But then I have some step definitions that says, and wait for this event to fire, which blocks basically my scenario test to wait until everybody's connected, and then I continue with my test. Yes? Okay, I'm going to continue. Why? I already gave a lot of examples, so maybe we'll go through this pretty fast. For me, the top one is very important. It is documentation. I write my documentation, and I can't believe I wouldn't believe I would ever do that like 4 years ago or 8 years ago. I even start out writing the documentation before I start coding. Can you imagine? Not always. So sometimes I already know the null pointer, then I'll just fix the null pointer and maybe make a regression test. But our front-enders use our feature tests. They go to our GitHub repository and they check out our feature test to remember what was that one endpoint again and what did I get back. And they link it to me, hey, this is weird, or can you change this? And that's super powerful, also for them, because the documentation is always correct, and it's always up to date, and it's always working. Because if it's not documented, I don't support it, but if it's documented, it's also tested. Did I put it here in a, yeah. So I have, by definition, 100% test coverage of the supported features of my backend. And that's why if I make a new endpoint, or if I make a change, I write a feature test, I'll implement the code, and if that's green, if that's succeeding, like I expected, and the rest of the suite is also still working, I'm happy. And I'll ship it to production immediately. And we've been doing that for years now, and been doing it in Blendle as well. I never go run my local server, then open the Pokey on my local machine and try to connect to it. I never do a curl request to my own server. I just write the feature test, and with one command, you can do all your curl requests in a Go, basically. That's super powerful. Yeah, what I said, it's super easy to write up front, because it's just in English. It can be used in any language. If you want to transition to another language, if you want to rewrite your microservice, you can reuse your tests. And I don't use my code base, run my code base locally anymore. Because I think, there's one project at Pokey that I try not to work on that doesn't have feature tests yet, because we don't edit it as much, so we never took the effort. And I dread working on it. I was thinking, maybe Eric can do it. He's more useful. He's more experienced with that service, I'd say. I just like running my things locally. Some cons I hear often, I don't always agree with. And these two I kind of agree. It's a little bit more work up front. Especially in Golang, the native testing suite is amazing. It's built into the language. I love it for unit testing. I use it. I think 40% of our tests is also unit tests just in Golang. But when you start a project, you have to write a couple of these step definitions. And I usually rip them from my old project, because HTTP is HTTP. You can just reuse these step definitions. And I'm sure you can find them online as well. But agreed, that's a little bit more work up front. And another one is it's a little slower to run. Especially if you run the whole suite. You first have to compile the Golang package with this runner in there, and then it needs to parse these feature files, and then it's to regular expression match all these step definitions. But on the other hand, if I run one of these scenarios, it will take 2 seconds. It's not as snappy as a unit test in your editor, but it's also not slow. And our entire test suite runs in 2 minutes, so it's just fine. And with that entire suite, I'm completely comfortable on Friday evening, ship it to production and go to sleep, turn my phone off. Also, Pokey is not a banking system or a hospital. Worst case scenario, something goes down and Cloudflare caches everything for 24 hours, so users won't even notice. But yeah, you can feel it's a little slower than native unit test. And then I couldn't think this morning. I couldn't think of any other cons. Maybe you can come with things you think are cons, and then we can discuss it later. It would be cool. Yeah. Ooh, I'm regretting this slide, demo time. Okay, let's see, first going to show you some scenarios and then we'll work on one as well. I have 3 projects in mind. First, I'll just show you our main backend, our features there. I think I have it here. This is the old one. Yep, this is the correct one. Let me edit a little bit things so you can read. This is for a developer platform where developers log in to upload their games. Here's such a background information. Like these 2 given steps are run for every scenario in this file. So in this file, I'll just assume this team and these users exist. And the first scenario is that an admin creates a new user within a team. When a client is authenticated as Kate, this step will just set some headers in the request, and the following 2 as well. And some headers are set, but when the client does a post request to /users with the following data, we're using JSON API as a format for our API. I'm not sure if that's familiar. It's kind of like a whole JSON. Well, in this case, it's a name and an email and the relationship you define which team it belongs to. Then I expect the response 201 with this header, and this is the response body I expect back. And here I'm using a little trick, is I say ignore included, because that's something I didn't want to bother testing. If it changes, I don't want it to fail, and it doesn't really matter for the reader as well. It's like JSON API embeds like relationships, so you don't have to fetch them again. And we don't think it's relevant for this test and this scenario. So whatever I type here, it will still run. But yeah, my front ender can easily now knows how to create a user and what it expects. And I also test that the following users records should exist. Like this developer should have been created a lot better. Embarrassing. And that no emails have been sent. That's because sometimes we send an email for a new user. I also give a fail. For example, when the client is authenticated as Jane, and if you look at the background, that's a normal developer. They will get a forbidden. So I know I didn't break the role system or authentication because I test that the developer can't create it, and also no emails in the sentence. One more maybe completely different example. That's a nice one. This is all kind of boring, just creating things and getting things. Maybe uploading. If you upload a new version, again I have some background. The game already exists, and here you see if you upload amazing game.zip, which is a fixture somewhere in the file, and in the step definition I just open that file. And you upload it to that URL, I expect this response, and that the following version has been created. And then I'm doing something weird, because that's an asynchronous process as well. And then I say, given the uploader is finished, that step just waits for, I think, a channel to just give a little signal. Then I expect the storage folder, and here I'm mocking S3 in just a simple abstraction layer interface. I expect the storage folder, this, to contain these files, and these are the same as in the zip file. And then I test some other things, like if headers in these files and ACLs are set correctly. I even check one of those files if the contents is the same. It hits some compression, and then it also publishes an event, because we want notifications everywhere. And then, yeah, that's how the upload works. And for the developer, it's super easy to see where he needs to upload something and what he returns. Yes, question.
I'm curious about like the parser. How are you parsing this feature file?
Let's go for client uploads the zip. That's let me think. Test util test HTTP. and then I always go up because there are where the step definitions are. Uploads. Well, here I get the file name and the path, because you upload this file name to this path, if you remember. I open this file, and I make a multi-part writer, because that's how files get uploaded nowadays. A multi-part writer, sorry. And I attach that to the request that I've prepared in these steps, basically. And then I do the same as a normal post.
So the upload is a key there in that step basically.
Yeah.
So you have a kind of like some grammar to pass
Yeah.
feature file.
Like for example, if you just do a normal get or post request, that's when the client does a blank request to path, basically. Don't have too much time. I want to show the other. I want to do the demo as well. Quick question.
Aren't there any nice Visual Studio plugins? I can immediately send you to the.
In Ruby, yes. In Python, yes. In Golang, maybe. I haven't looked at it yet too much. But as I said, I never touch this code like once in a year. Quick question.
Yeah, quick question. Mention that you're maintaining multiple repositories.
Yeah.
How do you manage this grammar and how do you maintain it across all of those?
At Pokey, all our goes in one repository, sort of mono repository, so that's fixed. At Blendle, we had a separate, which was in Ruby, we had a package, like a shared, it was I think even an open source where all our step definitions were defined in, so all our projects use the same grammar basically. Okay, next I want to show the JavaScript one. I don't think I'm going to go into the step definitions, but just to show you a different kind of example. It's a library to peer-to-peer connect web players to each other using the technology from Google Hangouts. And this is a scenario where I decided these steps read as if a player called a caller does things. So in this case, given blue is connected and ready for this game, and yellow as well, when blue creates a lobby, blue receives the network event lobby with this argument, and I set the seed onto something static, so I'll always get the same random ID. And then when I kind of do another when, I decided this, probably not right. When yellow also connects to this lobby, they'll both receive the connected event with these arguments. This is how and it spins up in Node.js a couple of my instances, instead of me having to every time go to a browser, refreshing 2 tabs or 3 tabs if I want to test 3 connections. That's a nightmare. If you make a change and you have to manage 3 tabs to do a certain scenario for you, like that's going to slow you down. I just alt up to my terminal and I hit up enter and it runs the entire scenario, which is very. This took a lot of time to set up because it's using a Golang server in a JavaScript environment, using a different implementation in Node.js than in the browser. To be honest, it was kind of a pain to set up because I have never done this in TypeScript as well. But I was super happy now when it was running. So that's nice. And now let's go to the one we're going to edit. It's a very simple service. It's so simple I can explain it with a feature test. It's a upload to S3 service, and it checks that it's an SWF file. Because, let me find some windows. Upload a single SWF file. And when the client uploads this file to this path with these form values, I'll expect this thing and this response. And this fixture should exist at that stored location. Here I'm also mocking S3. I just have a store interface and one that actually implements connected to S3. It's actually cloud storage, but same bit. And I have an in-memory version basically. And check if the stored file has these headers, because I wanted to save the original file name and that the ownership has claimed yes, because that was a business requirement. Now, the scenario is my front ender comes to me and says, I need the original file name back in the response. Super simple. So I would just change it here. Let's call it original file name. And it's hello world, thank you, GitHub Copilot. And there are 2 scenarios here, so I'll just copy paste it here. I could then now make a pull request, a draft pull request, given this was a little bit of a more bigger example. And it would fail now if I run it now. Let me do that. Go test features. This should fail. Yeah. You see here, it's missing, it's red. The original file name is red. It's missing this. But I can make a pull request, send it to my front-ender. If you mark a draft, it doesn't run CI. Is this what you want? Can you work with this? They'll say, maybe you can make a shorter key name, whatever. We'll discuss a little bit, we'll change it a little bit. Then we're done. Now I'm implementing it once. For now, we'll do the same thing. Okay, let's make this change. I also verified that it didn't already do this bug or something, if you're making a bug. I think this change is very simple. I have a response struct. I'll just add the original file name. Oh, and come on. Go pilot. Almost. And let's also, I'm done. Super fast, I'm not done. Let's test it. Nope, I wasn't done yet. I need to set the field, of course. And now you see how fast it still is. This is a smaller project though. Let me think. Somewhere here. Thank you. Copilot. I also set that in the response thing. Is it now green? Yes. It's good. If you do verbose, it also print the working, it will print everything green. So I also know I didn't break any of the other features of this project, which are very little. Pull request, get a code review, hit merge, it will go to production. Yeah, that's how my work looked. And I didn't run this server to test it. I didn't bother. I don't even want to bother. Where's my slides? I have one more slide and I'm done. Closing notes. We test most of our happy paths only with some edge cases and maybe how an error looks like. And then after the issue, I'll make a regression test. And our edge cases, we usually just make unit tests for the functions, not for the handlers. And as I said, it's super useful that you don't get an error. If you make a regression test, you never will get the bug back again. Thank you for listening. Any more questions? Yes.
So in my company currently we have like agile testers which are writing the scenarios. Do you have any like experience with having separate people writing the scenarios and teaching them or making them define this?
So for me, I've only experienced it with front-enders writing these scenarios, and I just accept them wrong. And I know what they mean, and I'll edit some things. And usually they are coders; they understand the system, so normally they're fine. Maybe have an editor that you can pick steps. So the step definition always exists. Test that basically. You could probably write like a linter or something as well. I'm always for teaching non-programmers to use something like GitHub with GitHub Desktop, because then they can just participate in pull requests and maybe looking at scenarios. My front-ender checks my pull requests and only reads the scenarios. I usually commit them in one commit in the beginning, and he knows to just go to commits, and then there's one commit called desired feature tests. He clicks it and he thinks, oh, this is something I can work with, looks good, approve. And I know, don't merge it, the backender needs to look at it as well. Yeah. Cool. Any more questions? We're kind of out of time. No? Perfect. Thank you.